Hello and welcome back to CST 2120. So in this lecture I'm going to just introduce testing. So testing's often badly taught, not taught at all. Occasionally you get like a specialist module, dedicated to testing. But in the rest of, learning programming and all the rest of it, you write some code for your assignment, test it yourself until it mostly works. You hand in the assignment and then probably delete the code later, when you don't need it anymore. So normally code's pretty badly tested, yeah? But in the commercial software environment, you're working in a team. The team's developing code that's absolutely critical to the success of the company. If the code breaks, customers are unhappy, the company loses money or goes bankrupt, right? So if Amazon, the retailer goes down, for every hour that the website's not online, they're losing a great deal of money. And they're also potentially losing customers in the longer term because they'll think, well, if Amazon's not working, I'm not going to bother using Amazon anymore, yeah? So it's really, really critical that the company checks the functionality of the code before it's released and constantly checks the functionality of the code as the web application and website's running, in the case of website, obviously. Another reason why testing is so important is that software developers, they're working in a team and they're changing part of the company's code. Yeah, so maybe you're sort of just joined a new company and you've been asked to change the kind of mathematical functions, add a new mathematical function, for example. And that mathematical function might be used in lots of different parts of the company's software. And if the person who's editing and changing and updating the math function changes it in a way that breaks this functionality, then all kinds of bits of code could, fall over and die on the rest of the company, yeah? Especially if it's a, core piece of, utility software that's used by lots of different bits of code, yeah? But the person who's kind of fixed that or changed that functionality might not be aware that it's broken other stuff elsewhere, yeah? So to protect against this kind of problem, we often use a variety of methods to automatically check their code, yeah? So then if the code is all being automatically checked, then the person who updates the maths functions and checks it back into the repository, then the tests will automatically run, and then these tests will detect that the new maths functionality is broken functionality elsewhere, yeah? So you've got all these kind of alarm mechanisms to make sure that one piece of code that's used by a lot of different other bits of code doesn't just basically smash the entire website, yeah? Now, one of these tests is validation, and this validation basically checks that the structure of data or markup files is correct. Yeah, so you've got HTML validation, CSS validation, and you can validate XML and JSON files against a schema that defines the structure of these particular files. Yeah. Then we have front-end functional testing. So obviously you've got a lot of graphical interfaces on websites, for example, or apps. And then, and what you have certain expectations about what will happen if the user clicks on buttons. So when for example, with registration, if I enter the wrong details and click on submit, the JavaScript stuff should pick up that that I've entered my email incorrectly or the password's not strong enough, that kind of stuff. And then we can write tests that check that this functionality is actually working from a front-end perspective. Sometimes these are called user acceptance tests. And Selenium's often is a library that's often used to test these websites, yeah, in the browser. So in the browser, Selenium can, you can program it to enter data into the fields, click on buttons, and make assertions about what should happen when you do that, yeah. And then we have unit testing, which is very common in software development. And when unit testing, we have certain functions or units, like methods within classes or functions outside classes. And we're expecting that when we put in certain parameters as the arguments and execute the function, that certain things should be obtained, or the database should be changed in certain ways, or the class state should be changed in certain ways. Yeah. So these are testing the functions independently or as part of a class. Yeah. And for unit testing, we often have to change the code to make it testable, yeah? Because if all of your code is just, within the HTML file or something like that as a script tag, then obviously you can't really test it or import it into your test in order to make it testable, yeah? And the same goes with server-side code with Node. You really want to split your code up into nice chunks so that they'll make it more easy to test those chunks rather than just having some long, complicated function that does everything, yeah? And there's also a kind of software development methodology called test-driven development, which kind of highlights the importance of tests from the very start. Yeah, so the idea with test-driven development is that instead of writing the code and then testing it later, or never bothering to test it later in many cases, instead you write the test first that specifies what the code should do, and then you write the code that will then pass those tests. And then there's a sort of iterative cycle where you write improving the test, improving the code, improving the test, improving the code, until you have a fully tested application. But in the test-driven development approach, we're starting with a test rather than starting with the original code. Yeah, it can in some cases help you write nice clean code that works. And it's all part of this kind of agile development methodology, which you may have run into a few times already during your studies. Yeah, so this is slightly old search, but you know, if you have a little look for TDD or test-driven development jobs, there's quite a lot out there. Yeah, and when you're running tests, then most of them are designed to be run automatically, yeah? So, you know, all your unit tests should be running automatically, or your Selenium front-end test can run automatically. And these automatic tests should run whenever new source code is committed to the repository, yeah? And with a live website, some of the tests, not the database tests, but some of the sort of front-end tests, the web service tests, should basically just run all the time, yeah? So that administrators, you know, no one's going to manually check that every single page of Amazon is working perfectly, but the Amazon will certainly have a set of unit tests or web front-end tests that are just checking that the website's up and running, and then will alert someone who will be on duty or whatever if anything goes wrong with those tests. Yeah? Now, sometimes you have a separate test environment. So at Trinity Mirror, we had I think we had a sort of development environment, then we had a sort of test sort of pre-release environment, and then a sort of release environment. Yeah. So often with database tests, you don't want to run those in a production environment because they involve putting dummy products into the database and checking that the database functions are working. You'd run those kinds of tests in either development or in the production environment, or sorry, not in, either in the pre-release environment or in the development environment. Yeah. But obviously, live tests of website functionality can work in the production environment. Yeah. So when you're sort of building a sort of company, obviously you want to think about these different environments you need to set up in order to be able to, you know, test your application effectively. And what I should have mentioned as well, which I meant to mention, is that while there are lots of test-driven development jobs, or TDD jobs, there are also a lot of jobs that are purely test-based jobs. Yeah, so don't sort of rule these out when you're starting to look for jobs after you finish graduating, because there's a lot of jobs that are purely test-based. I had a friend who worked just writing tests at writing tests at Sony, and so he had to sort of, you know, figure out clever tests, and then also be in dialogue with the team that was writing the code in order to develop better tests for that code. Yeah. So in coursework 2, because of this importance of testing and the jobs in testing, I put some marks in for that. And what I'm asking you to do is HTML and CSS validation as well as JavaScript tests. Now your code, to get full marks, your code must pass those tests. It's not enough to submit failed test results. Yeah, you'll only get half marks for each test that fails. And prove that they pass, because we're not going to run these tests ourselves, you need to include screenshots of the result of the test in your final report. A really important part of testing is obviously you want to test, you know, the code that you're actually running, yeah? So you mustn't write a special extra code like some pointless maths functions you're not actually using anywhere and then write tests for those maths functions. You're not going to get any marks for that, yeah? Your JavaScript test must be meaningful tests, yeah? The test of actual functionality that's making your website run, yeah? So don't write new functions and test them. And you must perform the right kinds of tests. I'm asking you for the validation of your HTML and CSS files, and I'm asking you to write JavaScript tests, either unit tests or tests of your web service. Yeah? You don't have to use the exact testing framework. If you've got some nice kind of, you know, different way of validating this HTML and CSS, that's fine. If you want to use QUnit instead of Mocha to test client-side JavaScript, that's also fine. But the right kinds of tests must be performed, and you must document the results of those tests. Okay, so this lecture is really just introduced the importance of testing, explain the different kinds of testing, and really also wanted to highlight the fact that testing is, you know, a job that people do, you know, possibly for their entire career. So that some people obviously do more development work, but some people work in testing and write code, that tests, you know, other people's code, which is very important part of the software development process. Yeah. For coursework 2, you need to validate your HTML and CSS, and also perform JavaScript testing. The lectures are based on Mocha and Chai, but you can use a different framework if you like. Yeah, the test must pass, and you must include screenshots of the test results in your project report. And that's it.